everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of Null News. Now, if this is your first time here, I want to welcome you to a new segment where we talk about open source and cloud news in general. And we talk about these things and we have a little bit of a discussion, so please feel free to join in the chat if you're interested in these. And welcome aboard. So that being said, let's start with my traditional all opinions expressed here today are that of my own. They don't reflect anybody that I work for currently, previously, or in the future. They're just my thoughts of my own, and nobody has paid me or asked me to say them. All right, well, that being said, let's jump into it. Now, we're going to talk about Docker, but I wanted to jump into one thing that I missed last week really quickly in case you didn't get it at the end. I think it's really, really cool, and I want you guys to see it. So what it is basically what it is I forgot that my shortcut keys for OBS actually interfere with my OBS shortcut, and my Chrome shortcut keys interfere with each other. So let's, no, that was completely useless. Here we go. There we go. Sorry about that. All right. So if you didn't notice it last week, basically GitHub introduced a new feature in partnership with Microsoft and Visual Studio Code, which I think is just fantastic. Now, if you're looking at my class is completely open source, and I'm slowly releasing episodes on it, but the whole thing is on GitHub. And if you were to be here and be like, I noticed, a typo or could add more information here, but didn't want to pull the whole repository just to fix my bad spelling here, all you have to do right here is type the character period. So type that character period, and you will now be set up with a web editor in that class. And you can now see right here, we're able to edit it and do whatever you'd like to that README. You can see here's that README that we were looking at. And I think that this is absolutely fantastic. Another way you can get to it is basically wherever you are, just type in .dev instead of the normal .com for GitHub, and here you are. So this is fantastic, and I think really, really, really great. And I just wanted to make sure everyone was aware of it, because there's a ton of times that I myself have been in the position where I wanted to make a quick change. I saw, a paragraph missing, or, some sort of bad documentation. I just wanted to make a quick change, but I didn't really want to check out the whole repository. And this is going to be fantastic. You can do a pull request all right inside there. And I think it's fantastic. So let's move on with security, and then we'll talk some Docker and stuff like that. Let's go to here. So some of the most affected things this week, if you are an SRE or have anything to do with your data center compliance, Confluence Server had a massive critical security bug, and you need to patch immediately. Remember all this, the links will be in the description, but this CVE 2021-26084 is basically, it's a 9.8. Again, I have never seen a 10.0, which I think 10.0 basically means that you can, I don't even know. The ability to log into a Mac as root with no password was a 9.8 as well. So 9.8 is very severe. 9.8 is very severe. Just understand that. So you need to patch. If you're running Confluence Server in your data center, make sure to patch. There is, and links to this will be in the description. Moving on, we have also a Microsoft Exchange CVE. So this one, the 21.33.766. is not as bad as the last one, but does allow you to reconfigure stuff. It's a little bit harder as far as I understand. And the most important is it hasn't been proven to be exploited as far as yet. Whereas this one from the Confluence is actively being exploited. It's super important that you guys patch that. Super important. Go patch that. Another problem affected another remote code execution, which is one of the worst ones, is in the pack resolver from NPM. So if you're using NPM and you're using pack resolver, you need to update to the latest 5.0 release because there is a high security vulnerability. Basically, remote code execution is one of the worst things that you could have on your server. Moving on. This was just going into a little bit more. I guess it's I don't do a whole lot of NPM, so I apologize. I do know what a pack does. Although, wasn't pack the pack protocol part of Netscape, like in 1995 or something? I think it's pretty old. So, anyways. I was kind of surprised. It makes sense why it's still used. It just took me by surprise when I saw that. All right, so let's move on to cloud. That was all of the high security, high vulnerability topics for the cloud. Those were the things. I didn't see anything else come across my plate, and so yeah, that is it. So let's talk about Docker. Who's up for talking about Docker? So Docker this week made an announcement. Actually, they didn't really make an announcement. They just kind of did it, which I would have preferred an announcement in a blog post. But honestly, Docker has been burned in the past by blog posts and announcements, so maybe this was the right way to go. I feel like Docker gets the short end of the stick. Now, don't get me wrong. They have, especially their CEO, have sent some interesting emails. And I'm not going to defend Docker because Docker has dug some of its own grave. But that being said, I do also think some people just want to get stuff for free and not pay for it. But I would be remiss if I didn't talk about how Docker has Docker itself really revolutionized the Linux container, as we'll talk about Linux containers as the C groups and namespaces specifically. If you're talking about OCI container, that's really more of a spec for... Yeah, it's more of a spec, and we can get into that. And there's actually an article later on that was actually posted to the Discord, and thank you for posting that. It was a really good find, and I really appreciate it. And we'll dig into that a little more. So anyways, let's talk about Docker here. First off, you'll find articles all over the internet like this. Docker changes its subscription plan, usage, and rules. Now, I dug into it because I was a little interested, and honestly, this is not that big of a deal. If you're fewer than 250 employees and make less than 10 million, it doesn't matter. So even if you are a company with 50 employees but make less than 10 million in annual revenue, it really doesn't matter. And if you're talking about personal use, education, and non-commercial open source projects, it also doesn't matter what it changes. Now, it does change is this right here. Basically, you were able to use it for free if you were open source, even if you were a business. But this makes sense if you're a business and you're making money, not non-profit open source, then it makes sense that you should pay for Docker and its distribution. It literally distributes and is one of the key things, and they keep adding features. It's not like it's stagnant. So if you think that's wrong, I don't know. I still feel like they're supporting the open source community and asking companies that can actually afford to pay for it to actually pay for it. And they have supported a lot in the open source. I bet they've made wrong mistakes and wrong decisions in the past. So anyways, that's the big news that has happened. Do I use Docker? I do. I actually make sure everything that I do on the Null channel gets a container pushed out. I use GitHub repositories as well, the image repositories, the container repositories, which is getting better. Actually, I think I have to go back and verify, but I think last month they actually updated it where you don't have to be logged in. So when they first released GitHub Container Registry, it was actually done in such a way you had to be logged in as a GitHub user to actually pull it, even if it was a public image. And I think they've resolved that. I have to verify though. Don't quote me. Does anybody know that off the top of their head? I'm fairly positive it's true that they've resolved that. And if so, I think it's a fairly useful place to deploy it because you get to deploy it right along with your code. If your container image can sit right beside your code, that's fantastic. That's awesome. But I also try to deploy everything that I deploy to Docker because it's the standard place people like to go pull. If you're talking about where your Kubernetes cluster that you've stood up, the default location it looks to pull is Docker Hub. So I think it's a great place to continue supporting, and I think that businesses would be remiss to not support it. It is the de facto place, and their asking is not a ridiculous ask. Their requirements here are not difficult to meet. I still get to use it for free. I still support what they're doing with Docker Hub. Not saying that Docker hasn't made mistakes in the past. Again, they have made plenty of mistakes, which I think is what gets them into this predicament. If you look at what Grafana did, Grafana pulled a similar stunt just a few months ago, but Grafana has had a whole lot less kickback from their licensing kerfuffle because they've been nice to the open source community in general, so they got much less kickback than somebody like Docker. Docker has this mark on their record, and so people like to complain. That's my 2 cents on the Docker. So yeah. Anyways, let's move on to cloud. If nobody else has anything to say, that was my thoughts. What are your guys' thoughts? Please leave the comments in the chat or join the Discord if you like to chat about it more or argue how I'm wrong on this. I love being wrong. I made a whole video on that. Don't really love it. I like to learn from it, though. Yeah. So, we have some cloud news. Let's jump on to more cloud news. I know this is a little bit of cloud news. But while we're at it, if you are enjoying this news and you like this and like to support it, please go ahead and like this video if you don't mind. Makes me happy when you like it. Anyways, moving on. Azure has a couple of things that I thought were actually good. In general, I don't cover that much from Azure because, it generally follows behind what AWS does, but they have their general availability of their Azure route server, which I really think is one of the nice things that they provide. The Azure route server is fairly nice, and so it has joined general availability as of this week. Then we have the Azure DevOps updates for August. And so basically, Azure is probably one of the leader in DevOps or supporting DevOps in your cloud infrastructure from what I have seen and used. Now, that being said, I don't actively use a lot of Azure DevOps. This is just from what I've seen of them and what they're releasing. So here is a list of all of the updates that they have for Azure DevOps for August, which, this is the beginning of September, so that makes sense. So I'm going to leave a link to this. If you're into Azure DevOps, you can check out some of this. And yeah, check it out. I think the update to delivery plans is the coolest thing that I saw, but we'll get into some of the other things because there's some more. This is the big Kubernetes news in Azure. So there's an update to policy compliance for Azure Kubernetes policies. So if you're using Azure Kubernetes, there's basically two things that came up. There's custom AKS, which is Azure Kubernetes policies, support, which is now in preview. So it's in public preview, which means you can go ahead and use it. And there was updates to policy compliance in their Kubernetes. So their Kubernetes is becoming much better and much more streamlined and allows you to customize your policies in a way that supports enterprises better. Basically, this is a very much an enterprise feature, but if you're an enterprise user, this is probably going to be very nice. And there's a whole bunch of things that this policy support brings along with it, which, one of my favorites here is this Azure Policy Visual Studio Code extension enhancements that allows you to basically auto-generate Azure Policy custom definitions in a template. So this is probably one of the coolest things that I see out of this, but there's a lot of things in like error reporting and stuff like that. So check this out if you're in AKS. I don't think that a ton of people use Azure for its Kubernetes service, but I think its Kubernetes service is probably underrated. I'm not saying that its Kubernetes service is better than anybody else's out there, but I'm just saying that it's probably underrated. I've actually seen a decent amount on it that looks very promising, and yeah, so maybe you'll check it out. Another thing that I noticed here that I just found from Azure, which I thought was really super cool, was this board. They have an Azure deprecations Git repository, and they have this dashboard with deprecation notices, which is super cool. I haven't used Git like this, but these are like basically their issues that they're warning people of deprecations, and you can see when things are deprecating. So definitely check this out if you're on Azure. I love this. I absolutely love this. If you already knew that this existed, leave me a comment in the chat. But yeah, this is super cool. All right, let's move on. Let's talk about Google. One of the most fun things that I found about Google was their data sets. So if you don't know, Google releases a ton of data sets. And so I found this article on basically the history of the data sets that they're releasing in BigQuery. So the one bad part about this is they don't expose it through an API that you can necessarily just hit from your application. You actually have to write an application that uses their BigQuery and basically be using it in GCP. That's the one downside of this whole thing. But they have really cool data sets. So this last month, they actually released the Google Cloud release notes, which I thought was really cool. And I might even try to leverage. And if I do, I will definitely make a video of it, but that will be in a couple months. Don't worry. But yeah, they do a whole bunch of different things. And this one lists like the last 2 years of them, where this one has different COVID vaccination insights, whole bunch of different English. I'm sorry. And brain farts. You combine the two. It's like my life. Anyways, they combine a whole bunch of different data they get from Google searching and stuff like that. So yeah, definitely check it out. And you can check out this link and get a list of those. That was probably the biggest thing from last month. Yeah. Or last week. Sorry, not last month. Last week. All right, so AWS, here's just a couple of quick things from AWS. The general availability of SFX, as well as the AWS S3 multi-region access points. Supposedly accelerates datasets up to 60%. So check this out if you're using the S3 multi-region access point. They have a really cool introduction into it because I wasn't actually that familiar with the AWS S3 multi-region access point. And so this was actually a really good introduction for me. I think if you're having questions about it, you should check it out. All right, so then the AWS Elastic, they need to stop putting Elastic in front of everything. It's really getting tired. I guess they would just call it the file system. So maybe Elastic. I would prefer it's the Amazon file system, not the Amazon Elastic files. So AFS would have been better than the EFS because, it's the Amazon file system, but like, whatever. Really, this should be the AEFS because it's the Amazon Elastic file. Anyways, I digress. But, what were we saying about this? Oh, intelligent tiering to automatically optimize storage costs. So this is just as the service matures, they first solve the cool problem, and then they make the cool problem they solved better and easier to use, which also part of better and easier to use is optimizing your costs, which I know usually makes AWS cost less if you actually optimize, but it's in their best interest to make it better and easier to use, just what you need, and that's what will attract people to the platform. So I think this is good. All right, and that is it for the cloud section. Now, we have just a little bit on some random things that I found interesting in the cloud area, as well as software engineering in general. And then we're going to dive into service meshes. So I know that a lot of people ask about service meshes, so I have looked up the most popular service meshes. I'm going to give you my understanding of each one as best as I can. There's a few that I don't know very well, so really you're only going to get what I looked up in like 30 minutes of looking into that service mesh. But those are going to be the projects, the open source projects we're looking at today. So let's dive into the random articles for this week. Now, I know you all think that we needed another language, and I'd have to agree. So, thanks to OpenAI, we have a new language. This is the Triton open source GPU programming for neural networks. It's really like Python. I was looking at it, it made me think Python. And I don't really know, this is the difference if you diff these. I'm probably not the best at this, so don't ask me for this. If somebody out there has used Triton and can tell me why it's so much better, although it's supposed to run and be optimized for GPU tasks. So I don't know if that's the only thing. It does have a little bit of syntax change, but check it out. This is really cool. Matrix multiplication is always a cool CUDA problem, and is cool. So anyways, if you're into GPUs and whatnot, you probably already knew this. If you're not, there's a new language called Triton. This I was really, really happy to see. Now, if you don't remember, Nginx a while ago, I don't remember exactly when, got bought by F5. So F5 does these big load balancers for data centers and things like that. Firewalls, I think they do a lot of networking for data centers. And they bought the Nginx project. And there had been some questions about what Nginx's commitment to open source was, especially because some of their things around Ingress, like the Nginx Ingress, weren't necessarily open source when they were released. And yeah, so there was, or their service mesh, not their Ingress controller, their service mesh were not open source. And so basically in their Sprint 2.0, they gave a much better vision of what their commitment to open source, which this was refreshing because a lot of places like Grafana had been kind of stepping away from that. Now I know Grafana is still committed to open source, and they're still committing and contributing to CNCF projects quite a bit. So, but there has been a lot of turmoil in the space is the thing. Especially you want to look at your databases. Tell me which database has stayed open source except for crates.io, which they still haven't given me an interview, but I would love to have an interview with them because they have actually committed to staying Apache open source. Well, that and Prometheus. I don't know why I said Prometheus, but I mean, it is a time series database, so Prometheus, and I was going to say PostgreSQL. So anyways, this was really refreshing. You should check it out, especially if you're into Nginx. I had worries about Nginx commitment to open source, and this has alleviated some of them. So, and they said that they're releasing 2 new open source projects. So more open source. So they're going to release 2 new open source projects. They haven't released them yet, but I will let you guys know as soon as I find them. So as soon as they're released, they also did a what's open source and what is commercial, which was a good insight and kind of shows their guidelines they're going to be using. And so yeah, that's it's good. And I'll let you know what their new open source projects are when they hit. All right, let's talk about Facebook Experimental Sky Bison. That's at least what I'm calling it, Sky Bison. Anyways, it's a it's Python. I don't know why they did this, but it's a greenfield implementation of Python 3.8, and it looks like it's all for performance optimization. Now, it is not supported, but I found it really interesting because they did a lot of work on it with small objects, garbage collection, and things like that. And so, anyways, if you're interested in the evolution of a language, I thought that this was a really good project to check out because, yeah, it's Python and everybody loves Python. And yeah, so anyways, go ahead and check it out. It's just been released 11 days ago. I keep you guys on the bleeding edge. I guess I missed it last week because I guess technically it was released last week. Not that bleeding edge. I'm like 2 weeks behind. But yeah. All right, so let's talk about Netflix blog. I love it when large companies talk about problems they solve. Now, I wanna preface this, and I think this is a problem people do too often. Just because this is a problem Netflix solved doesn't mean you have the same problem. A lot of times, and myself included, I see a problem solved by Netflix or Google, and when I'm working in my little startup, I try to solve the problem the same way. And the problem is, I don't have the exact same problem. This doesn't mean not to plan on being able to scale and things like that, but your problem domain is much different. Netflix gets to throw money at hiring a bunch of engineers. And so their solution might work for them, but it might also require extra engineers. That doesn't mean we can't learn from these blog articles. I just mean to take it with a grain of salt. Don't just say, well, because it worked for Netflix means it will work for me and my team of 5. It just means that while it's a cool thing, make sure that you understand the problem they solved, why they solved it, and yeah. Anyways, great. This is a great article. All that aside, this is a fantastic article on reliable device management. It goes into depth on the technologies used, and we're talking about Kafka and other things that you guys already know, use, probably like, and yeah, how they built it and how they made it reliable, super reliable. So it's definitely worth learning from. Check it out. Rancher 2.6. Rancher 2.6 is actually the very first release of Rancher under their new parent company, SUSE. So if SUSE bought Rancher way back last year, and they have not released yet until now. Now, I know back in the... So back in August of last year, basically the higher-ups in SUSE thought that we could buy Rancher and release with Rancher like a month later. It was ridiculous and crazy. I used to work for SUSE back then. I have, and then I worked for Rancher just a very little bit, and then I have moved on. So I don't work for them, and I'm not talking for them. But yeah, there was some ridiculous plans, and they just finally released their first integration for Rancher 2.6. So this is their first kind of built-in with SUSE. So now, that being said, I don't know how much integrations they have with SUSE. And so I don't know that they are actually that integrated with SUSE. But Rancher 2.6, Rancher 2.5 was the bigger release in and of itself. And so you should check it out if you're into Rancher 2.5 and 2.6. I'm sure it's bringing more stability. One of the things that, actually, I know 2 things because I actually know the 2 people that are working on it, and they're fantastic engineers. Huge shout out to them. But they bring native support in Rancher to GKE and AKS. So basically, the original support that was in there, not great, and they rewrote it to be really good. And so kudos to those 2. Those two people would love to work with them again in the future. But yes, that is probably one of the biggest things that came out of it that I know of. Let's move on. This is the article that was put onto the Discord channel, and I'm going to say super thank you. It was a great article. Now, I want to make the preface. This person is talking about the OCI runtime specification. They're not talking about containers, or Linux containers, as we chronically call them. They're talking about an OCI runtime. And if you don't know what the OCI is, Oracle would like you to think that it's the Oracle Cloud, but Oracle is a horrible person for reusing an acronym. Anyways, OCI runtime is basically the spec for what can be used in Kubernetes as a container runtime. And yes, that does mean that you can make a virtual machine run in Kubernetes. Now, when you tell people Linux container, they don't think of OCI spec. So this is what I would contend with this person. This person basically says a container can be a VM. And if you're talking about the OCI runtime, they are absolutely correct, and I wholeheartedly agree with them. If you're talking about the OCI spec, it can be a whole lot of things. It can be something not even related to isolating a workload, to be honest, because it is just a specification for how those things would work. But they don't have to. They don't actually define how it actually works. It's just basically an interface, if you want to talk about it that way. That being said, if you're talking about Linux containers, you were not talking about the OCI specification. And the OCI specification, I wouldn't say really dictates what a Linux container is. And so I would inherently disagree that containers are not VMs. And so I think, unfortunately, this person muddies the water because they contend that a container can be a VM. And I disagree. I highly disagree. My contention here is that the OCI spec does not care how your workload gets run. And your OCI can run virtual machines, but those virtual machines are not containers. That being said, this person is an awesome person, wrote an awesome blog article, not saying anything bad about them. I'm just saying that I have a difference in an opinion, which I think is good. Feel free to have a difference in opinion with me and like this video. But, sorry, but it was a great article still, and I think you should go read it. So it's going to be in the notes of this video. So go check it out because it is a good dive into what the OCI is. And I think that's important. And what the OCI is and what it brings is very important to us. So definitely check it out. And yeah, I just have a little bit of an opinion of what a Linux container is. And I think my biggest problem is I have seen too much confusion as it is. There's too much confusion as to what a Linux container is. And too many people misassume what it is for things that it's not. And that's why I want to be super clear. And I think we need to be super clear with people as to what they are and what problem they solve. If you're looking at a problem of efficiently packing a server with trusted workloads, there's nothing better than a container, a Linux container. If you're talking about a generic container, sure, anything's a container. I mean, Troot was a container, a bad container, but it's a container. So I think it's very important to be very, very specific with what OCI containers are. So anyways, not OCI containers, Linux containers. I wouldn't say OCI containers. It's an OCI runtime. And this is where it's getting a little pedantic, but it's a runtime specification, which means all this is an interface for how to run a workload, which yes, you could run it straight on the bare machine without any containerization at all. the OCI spec really doesn't dictate that it has to be containerized. That's my only point here, is that the spec is just a standard way of running workloads inside Kubernetes. It's not dictating what a Linux container is. That's my point. I think that's probably the clearest way. If you guys want a video on that, leave me a comment, let me know. I could actually go into a video on OCI container or OCI runtime and how it differentiates from a container. But anyways, this is just how Kubernetes interacts with containers in a generic way. We can move on. We don't have to harp on this, but it's a fantastic article still, so I still suggest you read this. And kudos to Ivan. I think that's how he pronounces his name. I don't know. Rust 2021, I want to thank this person who wrote up a fantastic one. So if you don't know, Rust 2021 edition is coming out. So the last edition was the 2018 edition. So you'll be able to now do this in Rust 1.6. This is probably the biggest announcement, is that the 2021 edition is going to be stable. And this is super cool, especially if you're a Rust fan. So go check out Rust if you're into this, and check out this released doc. That being said, I found this hilarious. Google, in all of its infinite wisdom, has now released an operator for running Oracle in Kubernetes. So with the advent of stateful sets in Kubernetes, it has enabled people to run stateful sets or stateful workloads in Kubernetes, and that's what's happening here. They've actually made it so that you can run the Oracle in your Kubernetes with this Oracle operator, which I'm finding it funny that they had to make it and not Oracle. Does Oracle? I don't even know if Oracle has one. Let's go into service meshes. This is it for my random news. This is my random news feed. This is the Oracle operator. If you like this, let me know. But we can move on now to service meshes. So at the end of every single episode, I go into just something in the open source community. And so we're going to talk about open source service meshes. And feel free to talk about which service mesh you like. Please, if you're watching right now, comment with what your favorite service mesh is right now, and I will debunk the myth of that being a very good service mesh. I'm just joking. Just joking. All right. So if you don't know what a service mesh is, I'm not going to go over them, but in the description of this video, about 30 minutes after this video, this live is done, there will be several articles on what a service mesh is that you can read. And if you'd like me to do a video on it, please leave me a comment and I'll make a video on what service meshes are. That being said, let's dive into the open source service meshes that we have. Now, there are what I'm going to call the main ones, and you might disagree if you work at a different company, but what the main ones I think, in my point of view right now, are Istio, Linkerd, and probably Consul. But there's actually a whole lot of other ones, and I think that you should know about them because they're really cool. So let's dig into these. Ooh. As a solid reminder, before we dig into these, next week I'm out. There will be no news. My wife hasn't been feeling well, and so I'm not sure if I'm going to get that video that I somewhat promised you guys, but I will try to have a new video out for you on Monday that I'm working really hard on, but I'm not going to prematurely release it if it's not ready, because I am working really hard on it. And so, yeah, not going to do the news next week, which means in 2 weeks, you'll get one of those really great ones where I kind of compile 2 weeks of news into an hour, or hopefully half an hour. Anyways, service meshes, here we come. So Istio is the big one in the room. Everybody knows Istio, so we're not going to talk about it, but I'm going to talk about its cons really quickly if you're getting into it. It's complicated, it's hard, and it needs a team just to manage Istio. That's its biggest con, but it does everything, and it's really, if you are a large company, is probably the most fully fledged solution. So definitely, if you're in the looking for a service mesh, check it out. Then we have Linkerd, which Linkerd is like the only CNCF service mesh. So if you're looking for a purely open source, purely open source and CNCF service mesh, Linkerd is the right choice for you. Now, it doesn't have as many features because it's basically Linkerd version 2 is a rewrite from Linkerd version 1, and it's focusing only on Kubernetes, and it's focusing on being super simple. So it is by far the simplest one, I think, although Traffic might have a simpler one. That's up for debate, but it's a really good one. Definitely check out Linkerd. If it supports the features you need, I would say Linkerd is an easy sell if it has all the features you need. If you need the one feature that Istio has over it that I think they really should work on doing is multiple clusters. Right now, it doesn't support a single control plane over multiple clusters, and that's the one thing that I'm really looking for them to solve in it before it's hands down Linkerd before Istio. Istio is just too complicated. I'm sorry, it is. When you're looking for a service mesh, you don't need too much complexity. Now, another one here that maybe isn't as known is Kong Mesh. Now, I don't think Kong Mesh is open source, but do you know what is open source? Kuma. Kuma is probably what actually powers the Enterprise edition. I'm going to say this is the Enterprise edition, Kong Mesh. So Kuma is their fully open source service mesh. And now that being said, I don't have a whole lot of experience in Kuma. It looks simple enough, but I don't really know how it differentiates itself from other service meshes itself. So basically, it's there though. So if you're looking into service meshes, you can look into Kuma. Now, HashiCorp also has their service mesh, which is Console. So if you're looking for a service mesh, if you're already sold into HashiCorp, Console. And their architecture is fairly good. And that brings us to Traffic. Traffic Mesh. So one thing to note here is that it's actually Traffic Mesh. And so Traffic has an ingress controller, and I'm sure you guys know who Traffic is, but they have their own mesh as well. And its goal is to be super simple. So if you're looking for a super simple service mesh, I would say that I have far less experience with Traffic Mesh than I do something like Linkerd. But Traffic Mesh is a suitable solution. And I know that there was people in SUSE when I was there that played around with Mesh, and they thought that its take on the service mesh was actually really refreshing, and they really liked it. Now, that being said, a year ago when I got to play around with it, it was lacking some crucial features, but it's been being developed for the last year, so I don't see why it wouldn't actually be up to date now. Now, I do believe, I do believe that it's had a lot of work in the last year. And when I used it last year, it was stupid simple, just like Linkerd. I just have a little bit of a little less knowledge on Traffic. So those are the service meshes I know about. What service meshes do you guys know about? If you think of one that I missed here, please. I know actually when we were talking about Kubernetes orchestrators, somebody did update with ones that I had missed, and thank you for doing that. I super appreciate it. It really helps the community as a whole. There are so many projects out there, it's impossible to know them all, which is some of the reason I take the time to actually go over these projects for you guys. Maybe I should make a video on just service meshes, but these are the ones that I really like. Now, my bread and butter service mesh is Linkerd. It's simple and it has 95% of the features that you need. Now, there are key features outside of that, and if you're dealing with those, you're probably a really large company, and it's probably fine to take on the added complexity of something like Istio. And so I would then probably switch over to Istio. It has the largest community as well as the largest number of things that work with it. So yeah, that's it. And that being said, I do have 3 articles on: 1, are you ready for a service mesh? 2, what a service mesh is, and 3, an introduction to service meshes and how to use them effectively. I say how are you ready for a service mesh because I think honestly everyone's going to need a service mesh, just not initially. A service mesh is probably going to be one of those things everybody at some point in their startup, every company as it gets to a certain level is going to have to start implementing a service mesh. I don't think right when you get started is the perfect time to do that. I think it takes a little time. So let me know if you'd like these things condensed into a video of their own, like, hey, these are the service meshes. I could do that, and maybe that would be really good. And consolidate my opinions a little bit more and make a little bit better of a worded video instead of this live video. Anyways, that's it for me this week. Remember, I'm out next week, so there will be no live video. I will try my hardest to get that video out Monday for you, but I'm going to be on a camping trip, and I'm not going to release it before it's ready to be released. So if it's not ready, I apologize. And I look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks. Have a fantastic rest of your week, and I hope that it's fantastic. Thank you guys, everyone, for your support. I really appreciate all of you. See ya.